Uno, dos, tres, cuatro.
The revolution will put you in the driver's seat. The revolution will not be televised.
Revolution.
The revolution will not be televised. Will not be televised. Not be televised. The revolution will be no more.
What's up, YouTube? You're listening to the Best of the Visual Revolutionary podcast. My name is Rick Stovall. It's my show. I'm your host. Do me a favor before you get too far into the conversation. Hit like and subscribe, please. Videos are coming soon. But until then, I wanted to get some of my favorite episodes out on this platform. Here's another one. Make sure to check out the show at visualrevolutionary.com. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Follow on Instagram at Visual Revolutionary. Good place to keep up with the show and when they come out. Send me emails at the website. DM me on Insta. I think that's it. All right, on to the show.
Revolution.
Dan Winters, thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule to do this show. I'm excited to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for giving me a buzz.
I'm a fan. You're an interesting dude. You got an intimidating body of work. It's crazy. I mean, it just, I was really familiar with the Dan Winters portrait work. I'm 40, so especially like the mid to late 90s kind of Rolling Stone stuff. And then I was a subscriber even to GQ magazine for several years. And so I was really familiar with your work in there. But as I took the time to really dig into some of your story and your body of work, man, it's really impressive. And there is no one niche. You're one of those guys that not only seems to enjoy shooting everything, but has had success in so many different fields. I don't know. Take that where you want. It's funny because on this show, we've talked several times, it comes up a lot about people kind of staying in their lanes and, really, picking a specialty and making that what you do. And it seems like you've really had a lot of success doing the opposite.
Yeah, I think if you talk to sort of an art school instructor, they would say you got to figure out what your thing is, right? What you shoot, because you don't want to confuse people that look at your work. You don't want to confuse people that are looking at your portfolio. And so I think that there's a tendency for students to start with to try and identify themselves through a certain subject, rather than identify themselves photographically. And when I started out, I think one of the reasons I wanted to become a working photographer was because it afforded so many opportunities to enter so many different worlds and so many different lives. And so that was kind of a real priority for me. I think the other thing that informed that was that I started as a newspaper photographer. So as a working photojournalist, I was constantly given really disparate assignments. One day it would be, cover a fire, and the next day do a portrait of a potter or something, just this very sort of different stuff.
Sure.
And so, I think if I had to shoot one thing all the time, I think some of the luster would sort of wear off. And so I really make it my business to try to work in a lot of different milieu. I do a lot of illustration work, and I do.
Yeah, you're an incredible illustrator. Yeah.
I love doing illustration. Illustration allows me to stay home and work in my shop, which I like to do. So, but yeah, I think the one sort of piece of, not advice necessarily, but an observation I've made with regards to student portfolios. And I do like to address sort of the student community quite a bit. The book I wrote a couple years ago, Road to Seeing, was
sure.
The intention behind that book was to make the book that didn't exist when I was starting out, because there was a big mystery to me as to like, how does this happen? And I wanted to sort of like demystify that to a degree, but is to really consciously, for students anyway, putting a portfolio together for them to look at the work that they're creating and try to find cohesiveness in each genre and present it in increments that allow the reader to understand that they're shifting gears as they're viewing. So not to sort of, mix it all up into one portfolio, because I could see that a portfolio reviewer would find that confusing. But if it starts out with portraits and then there's a little pause and then it goes into still life and then there's a little pause and it goes into this and then that, you understand that diversity is a part of your, vernacular.
To see somebody, like I said, not only branch out, but to have, you've had success in all these different niches. You've had exposure and definitely a lot of people resonate with not only the portrait work, which, like I said, I mean, you're very well known for. You've shot some of the biggest named celebrities and thinkers and presidents. It just the list goes on. But then your photojournalism work is amazing. Your some of the sculpture stuff you're doing. So to see someone, I have a tremendous amount of respect. And like I said, in all honesty, I just didn't know. I mean, I have seen some of your stuff in Wired before, but I just didn't realize it was you, and then once I was looking through, really kind of studying your body of work, I was like, oh man, this is him too. And then, a lot of your even more recent photojournalism projects, it seems like you still really pursue that world, as far as going out and covering, the water crisis and Texas gangs and different stuff. It just seems like you have so many avenues creatively to not get burned out.
Yeah, I think, the interesting thing about photography is, for me, is that, to a degree, the materials that we use inform the final photograph. So if I choose a camera and a lens and a film or a way of processing something, I'm determining partially like the way the picture's going to be, right? But at the end of the day, it's image making. So
sure,
that combination isn't going to yield a compelling photograph. That combination is going to sort of inform the tone of that photograph. But at the end of the day, still what we're doing is making images. And so I think a lot of work, really demands a certain kind of approach. So if I'm out shooting Texas gangs, I'm not going into that situation with a lot of production and lighting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's more of like just kind of being by myself with a camera, which I love doing. And the Flint story was similar. That was a little, I had an assistant with me, but it was the same kind of like very simple sort of, we shot large format stuff and very, very, very simple approach. But, once again, I think it does go back to kind of the idea. There was a certain naivete, I think, when I started out. Like, it's one of those things where you do it because you didn't know you weren't supposed to do it, and I think that really helped, right? Because I do agree that like an agent or someone that's at an ad agency or something, they want to peg you. They want to figure out what you are. I think people get a lot of satisfaction out of that. It's like, oh yeah, what kind of music is that? Oh, it's indie. Okay. And I think the artists, just like cringe sometimes at these kinds of labels, but I think the public wants to try to figure it out. And I think in our industry, certainly people want to figure out like, oh, he's an architectural shooter. So much so that I've seen interviews with people that say like, oh yeah, I'm really thinking outside of the box. I hired this architectural shooter to shoot portraits, and I'm like,
sure.
why is that thinking outside the box? Like, it's photography,
right?
It's a surface that reflects light, at the end of the day, right? It's a person, it's a building, whatever. But I think that people sort of like get some sort of satisfaction out of kind of trying to define us, and it's unfortunate.
Yeah. Let's do this. I know you've told some of these stories plenty of times. I've listened to interviews with you, but I do want to back up and I want to talk about, early days. We've had a lot of people on this show, and every once in a while you get glimpses into these people that really, it seemed like they had like a super early passion, and it was like it already had influenced in a way that they had a goal. I think it's rare, I definitely didn't have that. I was still lost in my 20s, but I mean, not that, I'm sure you had your own form of being lost in your 20s, but let's back way up. I know you were born in Ventura, correct?
Yeah, Ventura County. It was an unincorporated area south of Ventura. In Ventura County, it was an agricultural area. It was kind of in between the if I were to triangulate, it would be Moore Park, Fillmore, and Somis, kind of a
Sure.
real agricultural farming area. So yeah, it was real working class. When I was a little kid, my mom was fully stay-at-home mom, and we lived on a kind of a. My dad considered himself to be a gentleman farmer, even though he was a welder. So we had a lot of livestock, and
Okay.
I started raising bees when I was 9 years old, and so my income was I sold honey, and I sold livestock. So usually I'd sell a pig every year at the fair, at the Ventura County Fair. And
Whose idea was it to raise bees? I mean, was that something your parents were like, maybe you should try this, or was it?
no, it was so I was in 4-H,
Sure.
which is an organization that it's part of the Department of Agriculture. It was started in 1911, and it's basically designed to educate the rural youth of America at the time when there wasn't a lot of education for sort of agricultural pursuits. And so I lived in an ag area, and 4-H was a big thing. Sort of, it's almost like every kid you knew kind of was in 4-H. So it was sort of a social thing too for kids. And the way 4-H is broken down is that 4-H is basically what it is it's different projects, right? So you sign up for different projects and you have a 1-year arc with that project. So you can pick, small engines, like small engine repair, like was one my dad taught. And my parents were real active. They were instructors, et cetera.
Oh,
It's all
okay.
based on kind of the instructors in that community, like what is the talent pool in that community. So, there was a commercial beekeeper, Richard Ron, who had a commercial apiary, but his sons were in 4-H, and so he taught a beekeeping course. And there was only like 4 of us in it. It was me and his 2 sons and one other kid. Like, actually, I think for the most part, it was me and his 2 sons, and that was it. But, he helped me start an apiary, and, I would split hives, and I got quite a few hives. And I kept them out in the orange orchards because orchardists need hives in their orchards to pollinate.
Yeah, sure.
For a proper yield. I think citrus is 2.5 hives per acre. So that's kind of how that. And I was really interested in it. I think the one quality that I've always possessed, and I'm very grateful for, and I tend to really protect, is I have a real sense of curiosity, and that's really served me well. Jay Mizell said this really funny thing. You might have heard it, but it was a great quote by him. He said, "If you want to become a better photographer, become a more interesting person."
Yeah.
And I always loved that, But so the 4-H thing was big, and I actually thought I was going to become an entomologist. I studied entomology. I was obsessed with insects, and I really, to this day, just absolutely marvel over them. My first exposure to photography was in 4-H as well. We had a 4-H instructor, Claire Dalrymple was his name. He was a Navy photographer during the Vietnam War. And he had a darkroom set up in his house, and his sons, Kenny and Chris, were good friends of mine. And I remember the first time I went into a darkroom was at their house, and he showed us how to make a print. And so the idea of like exposing the paper, putting it in the chemistry, watching it come up, etc. And I'll never forget that minute. I see it right now as I'm describing it to you so clearly. It was this incredible moment, and that really sort of sent me in that direction as well. I was one of those kids that I think, and I still probably as an adult feel the same way. I have a few too many interests, to the point where sometimes it's almost like baffling as to how I can possibly I wonder I'll never finish all that I want to finish in my lifetime. But
Yeah.
but I really that moment was pretty special for me. I had this friend Tom Lindsay who was kind of an instrumental character in with regards to my pursuing photojournalism. When we were in like 10th grade or 9th or 10th grade, he decided he was going to be a photojournalist, and he and I took pictures together, and I thought, well, that'd be cool. That'd be kind of a cool thing to do.
Yeah.
And I knew that existed, obviously. I mean, we got Life magazine at home. We got Nat Geo, and I knew that work existed and that there were people out there making those pictures. But, I think you have to sort of like do the math as a kid.
Sure.
The school I went to was really small. our counselor was sweet as can be, Miss Spore, but man, I don't feel like I don't feel like she had any sort of knowledge of anything that was outside of the box.
Right.
If you wanted to become, if you wanted to work at a factory, basically she could help you. But like any other pursuit, I don't think she really had any understanding of like how you could even achieve that. And I remember, I was really, as I still am, really interested in model building. I'm sitting actually at my model building desk right now. And I remember telling her like I wanted to be in movie special effects. I want to build models for motion pictures, because I was like super into, 2001 and Space 1999, UFO, Thunderbird,
Sure.
Star Wars, et cetera, et cetera. And she had no idea even what that profession was, let alone like how I could pursue a career in it. And so I kind of took it upon myself to figure it out, and I did figure it out, and I did that for a while, and I'm really grateful that I did. A lot of those experiences, I worked at a cabinet shop in high school, and then I was a model builder, and in college I was framing carpenter, worked on building houses. We built customs, but I had a lot of different kinds of jobs that I call on all of those now.
Oh, for sure.
As a photographer.
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious. You look at your work and, actually go back to that a little bit, because I definitely wanted to talk about, just going through some of your bio stuff. I had read that you had gotten a job in the motion picture industry in high school doing set building, model building. So, I mean, how did that even come about? Because once again, that's a very, just especially looking at your work, like for Wired and some of the almost kind of sculptural still life type pictures. You're like, of course he built models in high school.
That's funny. Yeah, the model building came about. What it was really is, once again, it was sort of a real passion for. I was building models like, Army tanks and airplanes and stuff like that.
Sure.
And my friend and I would film them and make these little movies, and we'd scratch build like, a bunker with like a cannon sticking out of it and blow it up and film it and stuff. So we were trying to make these like, Army movies that mimicked kind of, the kind of Army movies we could see on TV, like whatever, John Wayne, Sands of Iwo Jima or whatever. and like got into it way beyond just sort of a casual pursuit, like really designing shots and building the model for the shot. And, I started researching explosives and pyro stuff and smoke effects and, like getting stuff from the chemical storeroom in the chemistry lab and mixing up smoke effect stuff. And if you wanted kind of a more red smoke, add iodine, and if you wanted like a warmer smoke, you'd add sulfur, and like zinc metal dust and sulfur sublime gave you this. And so it was really kind of became like involved, and
Sure.
So it really became like kind of a complete preoccupation and passion during high school. So starting in like 9th grade, maybe even earlier, but certainly, by 10th and 11th, it was like all I thought about for the most part, and trying to figure out how to get it on film. And so I was so into doing this stuff and building these models that I started to try to figure out how I could do it for a living. And all I knew was after 1977, all I knew is, the three letters, right? The acronym ILM. And I was like, okay, ILM. Okay, I know they do special effects. I want to work at ILM, So at that time, after Star Wars, they were still in Van Nuys, and they moved from Van Nuys up to Marin, and for Empire. And so what happened was John Dykstra, who was the visual effects supervisor for Star Wars, he didn't go to Marin, and Dennis Murin ended up doing Empire, and Dykstra kept the ILM building on Valjean Boulevard in Van Nuys, and he started a company called Apogee, and their first project was Battlestar Galactica.
Oh, okay.
And so I figured that out, and I called, and I kind of like naive, once again, your naive taste
Sure.
oftentimes can open doors, right? So I just started calling, And of course, instant rejection. Yeah, no, we don't have any positions. And I was nowhere near as capable as the guys that were there in terms of like the craft. They were all like grown men, and I was like a 10th grader, or 11th grader. But what I did do is I sent some pictures of some of the models I'd done, and the guy Steve Sperling, I'll never forget his name. He was the guy that always answered the phone. He said, "Yeah, go ahead and send me some stuff." So he sent me some stuff, and I got a letter actually back from Grant McEwen. Grant McEwen was the model shop supervisor, or the model shop lead for Star Wars, and he sent me a letter saying, I really enjoy looking at your work, and I can't even tell you. I wish I still had that letter.
Yeah, man.
I don't know where the hell that is. I save everything. I can't believe I don't have it. But anyway, so I called Steve and I said, "Oh, I got a letter from Grant." And Steve said, "Yeah, I showed him and I showed some of the other guys in the shop. And I said, you think there's any way I can come down there?" And he checked and he said, "Yeah, you can come down." And we had a time and place and everything. It was kind of like a 4:00 in the afternoon type thing. So my dad drove me down there in his car. I didn't have a license yet. And he drove me down there. And the one thing I will say, and as a father and a parent, I've really tried to do this, is every pursuit that my son has ever had, I try to foster that interest every time.
Yeah.
I mean, his library is huge, and I always bought him books, whatever he was interested in. And he's a very, very curious kid too. He's about to graduate from UT, studied aerospace engineering, and he's a really brilliant individual and brilliant mind. And my parents did the same thing. We didn't really have money, but they always made time to take me to the library. It was never questioned. I always wanted books. That's kind of what I wanted. And they always got me books. And it was one of those things where I just, my parents, once again, like my dad taking me to this place, I should ask him actually now. I'd be curious as an adult. I really haven't had this conversation with him, but I'd be curious to see what his take was on that. I know he thought it was really cool because obviously, we go in there and there's like, all these, the Battlestar Galactica had not yet aired either. So this was all stuff that no one had seen. And it was amazing. The Galactica is like over 6 feet long and really wonderfully detailed model, and the fighters and, the Cylon ships and all that. It was amazing to see, So I got home and I almost immediately started building a Colonial Viper just from memory. And I built it and sent pictures of it to Grant. And, once again, got a letter back like, "Wow, I can't believe how close you got this thing from only seeing it once."
Yeah.
It was off. I have those pictures still. It was off for sure.
Yeah.
But,
but still,
it was close.
Yeah.
It was close.
Crazy.
And so, what ended up happening was Apogee, Universal took over Galactica. They started their own effects house, and they were doing Galactica and Buck Rogers in the 21st century, and they were doing Airport 77, and they did 1941. So they moved over by Burbank Airport, and it was called Heartland, and I got hired there. And I was in high school still, and I would go my first 3 periods, and then the rest of the day was what they called work experience. And it was if you had finished all your mandatory credits, it was like an elective, but you had a job, and it was a pass-fail. But your employer either passed you or failed you, but it was just for credit. So I got work experience, and I started working. So I'd go to school 3 periods and then drive down to Burbank and work till 6 or 7 or 8, and then drive home and do it again. And it was like the best time of my life. It was just like
crazy.
unbelievable.
And you were what, like a junior in high school or something?
Yeah, I was 16 when I started, and I turned 17. And
what did your friends like? I mean, like, what did they think? Just that's not a story you hear very often.
No, it wasn't. And it was also very, I remember one time taking 3 of my friends down to where I worked to show them, like close friends, because I was trying to explain, kind of what I was doing. I mean, all the my high school was so small. It was 73 people in my graduating class.
Oh, okay, sure.
I knew everyone from kindergarten. I mean, so many people I knew. I look at my school pictures that which I have all those group shots. And I'm like, oh my God, I like can name everyone in the pictures. But I took them down there one time, and of course they thought it was just the coolest thing ever. But yeah, I was kind of operating outside of, my sort of group of friends. I actually made friends with guys at the shop. I became closer friends to like the model builders I was working with than with almost closer friends in a different way, I suppose, because we had so much in common,
Yeah.
But yeah. So that was it. That was good times. I enjoyed that.
Just some prodigy kid hanging out with grown men, checking into work every day. It's just so funny, man, because like I said, I definitely had passions and interests in high school. And I think in my head, I thought, I was a real big fan of literature. And so I was a big fan of these writers. But man, I was just so busy chasing girls and, playing sports, I guess, that I don't even think I knew a version of you, like that's just such an outside of the box story to see some kid that's like so laser focused. I grew up in Kentucky, and kind of the same thing, when you had career day or your guidance counselor and stuff, it was just so doctor, lawyer, it was all in the box. And it was rare that you had someone kind of step into your life that you were like, wait, holy shit, like people make money doing that, and every once in a while when you get a little glimpse of that, I think that can alter your life.
Yeah. It's also that story of outside of your own family unit, like teachers that can inspire, like there were teachers that I had that were insanely inspirational and very formative, very supportive. I was always really, really interested in history, especially European history, like mid-century stuff, like World War II era, pre-war stuff, 30s, Depression stuff, and Civil War and et cetera, that era, just really like voraciously sort of ate that stuff up. And I remember my world history instructor where we had done like a huge unit on mid-century Europe or Second World War Europe. Dr. Connolly, he was a veteran from Second World War, and on the last day of class, which would have been the day before graduation, because graduation day there was no school, we just graduated basically, and I remember him saying, Dan, can you stay after, or Danny, I was called Danny in high school, Danny, can you stay after class for a minute, when he dismissed the class. And so I stayed back, and when everybody went out, he went to his desk and he pulled out this little box. It was a gift, and he said, of all the students, and now mind you, he was probably in his late 60s or in his 60s when he was teaching this course, but he said, of all the people I've ever taught, I think you'll value this the most. And it was a Hitler Youth knife he brought back from World War II,
Wow, yeah.
Like, holy cow. So I collect World War II stuff, so it was kind of an interesting thing. But I guess my point was that, he really saw in me someone that was curious and someone that wanted to learn, And there were certain teachers I had that were like that. Mr. Helgeson was my science and chemistry instructor, and he definitely, he let me use the science rooms back in the day had dark rooms built into them because photography was just a part of science, it was part of observing. And so we had a dark room. He used to let me use the dark room in there. And he taught the photo class and stuff. He's the one that actually took me and 4 other guys that were in the science class down to LA to see Star Wars when it first came out. And we waited in line for 2 full cycles, so over 4 hours at the Bruin Westwood. We went to the Bruin Westwood, which was at the time like this incredible sort of theater. And I think those people too, parents, obviously it starts at home, but we're fortunate if we have those people in our lives that help us along. And they give us a different perspective than our parents would give us potentially, So I think that's always important. I think teachers are such the unsung heroes, and it's amazing how marginalized society makes them. You know, we almost treat them as glorified babysitters. You know.
Yeah. Oh, it's so true. And I mean, you're right, especially, you know, at that kind of younger age when you're so malleable, like I said, to have, you know, especially like in a younger adult sometimes that steps in and you're like, oh, wow. You know, like you just get little glimpses into different ways of thinking. And, you know, you alluded to it earlier. You seem like you really absorb stuff and you're interested. And I'm sure people recognize that in you, and the good ones nurtured it. Like, oh my God, look at this kid. Seems like he's got a scientific mind but yet super creative. Someone needs to tell this kid to keep going, you know, and to have those early validations of like getting a job as a model builder, or, you know, the teacher even giving you the knife. I just feel like those are helpful kind of stepping stones at an early age.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify too that the knife he gave me was one that he brought back from the war. I don't know if I said that earlier. The idea of getting a Hitler Youth knife might rub some people off.
I got it.
Out of the right context. It made it that much more special to me that was the thing he chose to bring back as the memento of his service, and he was able to, and he gave that to me.
Yeah, gave it to you.
Kids. It's not. He didn't give it to his kids. You know, he had kids. That was kind of a moment for me. Was like, wow, really? Are you sure you want to give this to me? Kind of thing, you know. So that was kind of a huge thing. I had an instructor, Virginia Street, who I always loved. She taught modern dance, and she taught at first period. So the rest of the day, she would always wear like her leotard, and she would wear like a little wrap around her waist, like made it into a dress. But she was always like very sort of like, she always looked like a dancer, you know. And a lot of the guys like kind of had secret crushes on her or whatever, you know. It's like Miss Street, yeah, she's so pretty, and she was beautiful, and she was a really passionate teacher as well. And she taught several things, mostly English related stuff, but she taught Shakespeare, and I kind of took it as a lark, you know. It's like I wasn't really interested in Shakespeare at all. It was a class, you know, it's like any class, right? It's like, what class are you going to take, dude? Oh, let's take Shakespeare fourth period, you know. So we take Shakespeare. So I think basically it was the only class I ever had that I just absolutely was kind of a dick about. Like, I didn't care. I wasn't into it. I don't know why it was that I couldn't get my head. I feel like all I did was draw when I was in that class, and I didn't pay attention, and quarter grades came up, and I don't know if I was surprised or I expected it, but I got an F, and it was the only time I ever got an F in my whole life. And I couldn't believe it. And it was a required English credit for graduation.
No.
And so it was the last semester of high school, right? So I sat down with her and I was like, oh my God, okay, I know I've screwed off this entire time. What is it going to take for me to pass this class? She said, you have to get an A in order to get a C because you have an F already. In order to pass this class, you have to get an A this quarter, or you don't graduate, basically. And so, of course, that lit a fire under my ass, and I fully embraced the class and knew, like, okay, man, you got to rise to the occasion here. And I ended up absolutely loving Shakespeare, and I was like so into it, and I was like her star student, and I loved it. I really genuinely loved it. Like, I wasn't begrudgingly trying to get through Shakespeare. I was actually psyched about Shakespeare class. And so I knew that I was good to go, and I knew that I was going to get an A and stuff. But on the very last day of school, it was the same day that Dr. Connolly gave me the knife. I went to Mr. Robertson, who was the drama teacher, I was involved in the drama department, and he let me have access to the wardrobe closet in the theater, and I put together this full Shakespearean costume with like tights and slippers and like a big hat with a feather in it and puffy sleeves and the whole deal. And I waited till everyone was in class seated. And Miss Street, the door was closed. She always closed the door when the bell rang. So I waited till the door was closed. So I knew she was like taking attendance, and I gave it about 2 minutes. And then I just burst the door open, and I came in and totally didn't acknowledge anyone in the class. And I did the entirety of Hamlet's third soliloquy, like flawlessly, but fully acted it out, you know. And she started crying at her desk, And I thought that was such a great moment for me. And what it was for me to a degree is it was a way of saying thank you to her in a very unconventional way that probably would mean a lot to her. And she sat at her desk, like with her hands over her face, and it was kind of a really special moment for me too. The idea of like, knowledge is a beautiful thing, and we should really embrace it and also celebrate it.
That was a great story.
I've never told that story.
I like it. And man, I just like it. I mean, once again, as I kind of went through a lot of your work, and I looked at a lot of your schematics and little notes you had done and drawings for kind of preparations of shoots, and it just, to me, whether anybody else is entertained or not by these stories, they all make sense to me, because it just seems like you have a very, kind of scientific mind, almost, the way you approach your art form. Well, let's jump forward, because we could probably talk high school for a couple hours, So I know you went on to study photography in college, after the set building and all that, the model building and everything. Obviously you were still shooting in high school and you were still practicing photography, but what made you really want to then go study photography?
By the end of high school, I was still really interested in doing miniatures, and I feel like I'd gotten really proficient at it, and I'd established a group of friends that were in the industry. A lot of that stuff was, it's almost like a gypsy kind of existence. It's very like vagabond. It's like you go show to show. So it's like, the scuttlebutt on one set will be like, Spielberg's starting this film called 1941. He's crewing it up right now. And then people would kind of scramble like to get on that show. And then you'd work that show for a year or whatever, and then go on to another show. And in between, maybe you'd pick up commercials or whatever you could pick up, but it was kind of always like, that was a small community.
Sure.
And I'm actually still friends with a number of those guys. Some of the guys went up to ILM, so they're up in Marin now, and some guys stayed in LA, and some guys adapted and are thriving in the CG world, and some guys are kind of living at home kind of thing, just like they never adapted, and they have a skill set that is completely like irrelevant.
Yeah, antiquated now.
In the industry, which is so sad, because it's such an amazing, I've spent thousands and thousands and thousands of hours in darkrooms, and consider myself to be very proficient in the darkroom. And, it's really honestly kind of a skill set that's not really monetized. You can't really monetize it. I mean, no one really cares. Even the gallery. I mean, I just did a big show at my gallery of black and white images from New York in sort of the 80s through, current.
Sure, from the Grey Ghost book.
And Grey Ghost, right?
Yeah,
and David didn't even want silver prints. It's like, well, obviously I'll make all these are all shot on film. Should I do silver prints or what? And he's like, no, I'm thinking we should do this really big. Let's do like 40 by 40s and 40 by 60s. And I had a whole conversation with him about silver prints, and they're not really like, he said, yeah, there are a couple collectors that like want silver prints, but most people don't really care. They just collect the images. None of the shows he does now of vintage work, with the exception of like, I think he showed some Arbus stuff, but that was some of the stuff Neil Selkirk printed for in the 80s. Nothing, just all inkjet prints, which is fine. I mean, they're beautiful. Don't get me wrong. It's interesting how we can become so proficient at something, and how quickly it can become irrelevant. That skill can become irrelevant. There aren't a lot of typewriter repairmen out there anymore. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, sure.
That was a huge vocation at one time. The photography thing really started, like I said, in high school, when my friend Tom was talking about wanting to become a photojournalist. That I think I remember that conversation. I remember exactly. We were in his room, and I think I went over there. He had a pool. His family had a pool, so that was really cool. So I went over there. We were swimming, I think, and we were talking about photography and stuff. And he'd made this decision that he was going to study photojournalism, and he found a school. He wanted to go to San Francisco State, and he wanted to study photojournalism. And to me, that was like a serious conversation, only because it was very this idea that he had was very fleshed out. Like he had decided what he wanted to do. He figured out where he wanted to go and the kind of work he wanted to do. And he had sort of connected the dots. And I think I kind of lived a little bit like by following my whimsy. And there was never really, I mean, as much as these individual pursuits required like thinking it all the way through, like I don't think I ever thought of, you know, what would I be doing when I was 25 or 35 or 45. You know, I didn't really think that way. Like, how does this parlay itself into a career? And the vagabond nature, the kind of transient nature of the model building at that point for me, I remember it seeming, you know, I lived in Ventura County. All the stuff was in LA. I certainly was lucky that I was on the jobs I was on and on the shows I was on. But what started to happen is I remember getting off of a show and like the idea of driving down to LA every day to go around and try to like hustle up work was not very appealing to me. And I started working with friends, some friends of ours' dad had a construction business where it was just a framing business, but all they did is custom homes. And so I was talking to just completely like, you know, we talk about like how things kind of fall in our lap. I was having a conversation with him and he's like, oh yeah, we're doing this big. Now, when I say custom homes, I mean like these multi-million-dollar homes in like Las Virgenes Canyon, Calabasas kind of area, where it's literally like a six month framing job, you know, on a like 13,000 square foot house or whatever. So they brought me on as a grunt, which is the guy that like fetches the wood and sweeps up and does all that work. And I did that, and I had building skills, and so I very quickly became like a valuable member of the crew. And I did that for quite a while I was going to junior college at Moore Park College. So most of junior college I did at night, and it took me 3 years actually. So I started right when I graduated from high school in 1983 is when I finished. Well, actually it took 2 years because I stopped framing and I went one entire semester, and I think I took like 21 credits, and I went during the day, and I got an AA degree. And then I simultaneously had read about the documentary program at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, and I had studied German in high school and in college, and I have German origins. And for whatever reason, you know, it's just like kind of, I wanted to see Europe, you know, I wanted to travel, I wanted to do something that was, you know, once again, it was like kind of outside of the box, right? I wanted to go somewhere and do something. So I applied and I got into that school. And so I went to Germany and went to school for a while. And I think pretty quickly realized that like I had kind of romanticized it a bit, and it was really great. I don't regret 1 second of it. You know, I made some great friends and really, really enjoyed it. But and I'm really proud of myself for having this realization, you know, because at that time I was pretty like, you know, you get to that age, and my son's at that age now, you know, he's 23 and he's like thinking about like, what is my future? Where do I fit? What contribution am I going to make to society? How am I going to spend my life? You know, and he's mortified at the idea that he'll get a job at an aerospace place where his job description is, I sit at a computer all day. Sure. Like, he's like, I don't want to wake up in 20, 30 years and have that be my legacy, you know? So that's a really like kind of important moment, you know? And I think what happened was I was thinking that entire time that, wow, what am I doing here? What am I doing here? Am I just stalling right now? I know I'm having an incredible experience, but should I be back in the States? Should I be working? So I just abruptly kind of left, and I went back to California, and I applied at a newspaper in Thousand Oaks, the Thousand Oaks News Chronicle, and they hired me as their lab tech. I took in a box of prints, and they hired me as their lab tech in the interview, which I thought was pretty awesome, and it felt really good. And I printed for them for probably close to a year, and then I left and went to Australia with a friend for 5 months. We rode our bicycles from Sydney to Adelaide around the southern route, and then I went back, and when I got back, they had a staff position that they were interviewing for. And so I went and interviewed, and they hired me as a shooter. So we had 6 full-time shooters and a full-time lab tech and a photo editor, and it was sort of the best couple years of my life. I mean, I can't tell you how much I enjoyed that general assignment. I had a 62 Volkswagen and a scanner and 2 cameras around my neck, and I had what was the one, I can't remember, it was in Banana Republic when they still sent a catalog out. They didn't, there was no websites or anything. They used to send a catalog out, and they had the David Hume Kennerly photojournalist vest.
Oh, nice.
And I actually met him at a thing. He and I were both speaking at the Eddie Adams workshop, and I was talking to him, and I go, okay, I'm going to nerd out a little bit, but I still have it. And I said, I have a David Hume Kennerly photojournalist vest that I bought from Eddie Adams. I mean, from Banana Republic. Yeah. He thought it was the funniest thing. It's like, you got to be kidding me. So anyway, that was incredible, man, doing that work. And really, I think more than anything, it really, shooting 3 assignments a day, 5 or 6 days a week, and then shooting for myself all the time. It's amazing how nimble I was with a camera.
Sure.
You get so nimble. I think nimble is a good term. I know Robert Frank likened shooting every day to a boxer training for a fight, but it just becomes totally second nature,
Of course.
And it's so important, I mean, I would say every day, but it's clearly, obviously, every day you're not shooting, but I do shoot every day if you count the phone, because I shoot a lot of the stuff on the phone that I feel like I don't, I'll never do anything with it probably, but it's that same thing. It's the practice, right? Staying in practice. I was shooting, like, my wife poured oil in water last night, and it was like heating, and it was like these beautiful bubbles of oil, and I'm like shooting while I remember the lens on the camera fogged up because of the steam, but just the idea of like practicing. I'll never do anything in that picture probably, but the idea of like staying nimble. So I felt really, really, really good about my sort of ability to react and to see and to explore, and so that was kind of an amazing time for me, a very, very formative time.
I'm sure. How old were you? Kind of early 20s there? Or?
Yeah, sort of like mid 20s, maybe 25, I think.
Okay.
26.
Because right around there, you leave and go to New York, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, I was just going to say. So I applied to the Eddie Adams workshop, which was one of the great sort of full circle moments. I've had a lot of great full circle moments, but one of them was speaking to the 25th anniversary of the Eddie Adams workshop as the keynote speaker on the opening night.
Wow.
It was for me just like, I mean, I got up there and like I just started bawling my eyes out at the podium, because it was like I saw 100 of me
sitting out there in the audience.
Sitting out there, like I remember really, really well. I remember that opening night where the people came out and spoke, and Eddie spoke, and it was just like the world was before us, like our futures were what we wanted them to be. And I remember just feeling this sense of like incredible wonderment and excitement, and that I was in the presence of these people, and of course, you get into a situation like that and then you feel like a fraud because like, what do I have to say? But clearly, I guess some people think you have something to say. But being up there was like a profound moment, and I was totally fine. I was like talking to my wife and everything. And then when I had to go up to the podium and when I turned around and looked out, it like just hit me like a ton of bricks.
That's cool. So did you go to New York just for the workshop, or were you already moving there?
No, I went for the workshop, and the thing that happened was my uncle worked for GM. He was the head of publicity for GM worldwide, and I was supposed to stay for a night or two in his apartment in New York. He was meant to be there, and it was a whole like convoluted thing where he forgot I was coming, and I ended up sleeping in like the flower bed at the base of the stairs of his brownstone. And the first night, and got a hold of the super the next day, and like the super called him and verified that I was who I said I was, and then I got a set of keys and stuff. So Anyway, so that was my introduction to New York. But he had a car for me to drive because GM always provided him with a car. So I drove up there to the workshop, and I got there early, and it was the first year, so they were like frantically trying to get everything ready, and they were way behind schedule. And there was a big trench that ran from the road to the barn that was probably 100 or more yards long, and it hadn't been backfilled yet, and they had a dozer there. I kind of went up there and said, what can I do to help? Because I was early. I actually didn't even realize I was early. I thought I was getting there when it started, and I was pretty disorganized. And so they said, well, do you know how to drive a bulldozer? And I was like, yeah, I do. Can you backfill that trench? I said, yeah, no problem. So I spent the afternoon backfilling this, like, trench and compacting it and grading it and getting it all set. And then I remember Eddie came out and he was watching me for a little while. And it was this really great thing because I felt like I scored all these points with all these instructors that were there, which I was really psyched about. But anyway, so Eddie came up to me and he said, hey, I just want you to know that I really appreciate you doing that. And every night at the end of the day, you can come to the house. And you can come to the house meant that after the day ended, all of the photographers that were there, all the instructors, would go to Eddie's house, and they would have a like informal sort of like drinking, story swapping, cigar smoking kind of thing, and no students at all were ever allowed there. In fact, I talked to his wife at the 25th anniversary, and she said to this day, she said, you're the only student that was ever allowed in the house. So it's another one of those great, like, serendipitous kind of moments because, I'm here. I wasn't even talking. I mean, I got to be honest with you. I think I was just sitting there, like, in awe,
absorbing
and
it,
listening. Yeah, it's like listening to Carl Maidens talk about MacArthur coming ashore at Leyte and photographing that, and like just these incredible stories. What happened with that was Greg Heisler and Jay Mizell were there, and I showed Jay some of my work, and then this is at the hotel. They had a kind of informal sort of like portfolio thing one day, and he showed it to Greg, and Greg said, you should move to New York. Like he said, you should move to New York. And he said, Chris Callis is looking for an assistant, and I feel like you should really move to New York. I'll call Chris for you. So I moved. He said, actually, honestly, what he said was, what do you do right now? And I said, well, I'm a general assignment photographer for a daily, 35,000 daily. And he said, okay, this is what you do. Quit your job and move to New York. And of course, I was like, oh, okay, I'll do that. And I still good friends with Greg. Actually, just talked to him last week. But he told me at one point years later, he said, I could have said that to 100 people. Quit your job and move to New York.
Yeah, and they've been like, yeah, right.
And how many people would have listened? So I moved to New York, and very naively, I knew my uncle, but like I don't think the entire time I was in New York, I think I only saw him 2 times. So I made a small group of friends that were in the photo world that were kind of mostly assistants at the time, and a couple guys that were shooting. And it was really funny, it's like while I was working for Chris, I shot all the time, and I'd print every weekend and shoot portraits and just constantly shooting because I'm a guy that's going from shooting 3 assignments a day to a guy that's assisting someone. And I learned so much from him. I think more than anything what I learned is he working for Chris demystified the process of like doing a commercial shoot.
Sure.
Because I have no idea what that looks like. If I'm a newspaper photographer, I'm like, going with my own little like bag with a couple Normans and, setting up and shooting. And I don't really know what a big shoot's like. And, my first day, I think I started on a Monday. I started on Monday, and Tuesday we shot an American Express campaign at his studio. And it was just like, I'd never seen anything like it. This is the first time I'd ever had the experience of clients on set and clients consulting, kind of by committee. And it was really great for me to experience all that because I felt like when I went out into my career, I was very well equipped. I had a real sense of what it took to put something like that together, especially, I worked for him for a year. And so as time went on, my responsibilities grew. And I'd gotten to the point where I wasn't producing jobs, but I was very involved in how the thing would come together and how we would solve the problem, etc. So it was a really great primer for me. So I think to speak to, a beginning photographer assisting, I would say that I think one of the biggest problems I've seen that I was very conscious about is to have a strength of conviction about like what is my work. And I've seen a lot of assistants work for someone for a period of time and then produce a bunch of work that looks like that person's work. So I was really aware when I was working for Chris that his style, and I would say style because there was a very definite style to Chris's work, and it was based on technique, and there was definitely his sensibility that was thrown into that. But he did a lot of stuff where he was doing combined lighting, where he'd do flash and a continuous source on the background, so he'd get that blur effect, which is beautiful, very of that time. Hero did it beautifully in the sort of early 80s, late 70s, and I feel like Chris really made it into a science. He worked out all these techniques that really kind of propelled that approach forward and made some stunning images, and I was very fortunate to work for him. But I was really conscious about like not doing that work.
Sure.
I'd seen the work of other assistants he had that like basically just started doing that kind of work, and I was really conscious about, I'm not going to do that work. And the work I looked at, mostly in that period was I looked at a lot of like kind of the New York work and the kind of the 70s school. I looked at everything, but I was really intrigued by like Friedlander and Eggleston, and
Of course,
Papa George and Meyerowitz, and a lot of those kind of giants that came out of the time when Deanne Arbus, when the world was a smaller place and the community was a smaller community, and of course Penn, who's Irving Penn's still my favorite portraitist ever, and I just that's the kind of work I was looking at, and the work Chris was making was beautiful. That was kind of Chris's work, So I think being kind of true to ourselves is really one of those important takeaways, in terms of like just being able to answer those questions truthfully. Am I trying to create original work? Am I kind of rehashing something? And, rehashing stuff is totally fine if we're honest with ourselves about it. You know what I mean? It's like at the end of the day, sometimes, yeah, I've seen this before, but I got a job I got to do, and it's going to work fine for the job. And yeah, just be honest, just be honest. And it's difficult. It's a difficult thing. It's a difficult thing to ask those questions of ourselves and have to answer them with brutal honesty.
So you go from this kind of photojournalist background, and I love the boxing analogy because I think that's a great analogy as far as, you're just kind of working on that jab. You're working on these like simple, until you can do it in your sleep. And then you get the chance to, assist on kind of a higher level of commercial work. And I think that's, really kind of probably stepping up, like, really making a well-rounded fighter. But how did because if you've got this, your newest book really focuses on that. The Gray Ghost focuses on that time when you're in New York. And it seems like you're still in that body of work, and I haven't seen that much of it, but what I was able to find, you're still, it has kind of a street photography or observation kind of feel. And so how does that start to transition into doing portrait work and stuff? Was that because of Chris and working with him, or? Yeah,
that's a really good question. Actually, when I was in New York, I was shooting all that stuff, that kind of, street photography to me is like it's kind of a term that I feel like's been co-opted a little bit in the iPhone, Instagram culture. But I used that term always. But I mean, I would call Friedlander a street photographer, but it wouldn't look anything like I think what people would imagine, right? Sure. So I call it public photography, kind of a better term probably, because it doesn't sort of like try to define what it is. It only defines kind of like a potential environment within which the photos can be made. So when I was at the paper, I started I was looking at magazines when I was at the newspapers.
Okay.
And I started trying to make magazine pictures at the newspaper. So if I got an assignment, I'll give you a couple that I remember really clearly. Like I got an assignment to photograph the mayor of Moore Park. So I remember when I wanted to do that, I thought, okay, I'm going to find a spot. I'm going to communicate with the person to meet me at that spot. I'm going to bring lights. I'm going to do this like as though I were shooting, a magazine job. And so that was, I think, that wasn't the first time, but I remember that being a really successful, it ran like 8 columns on the front page. It was a very sort of like prominently placed, and I felt like it was really successful. And in a sense, what I did is I built that photograph.
Right.
I controlled everything. I controlled as much as I could prior to beginning the photographic process, right? And so that was all production stuff. So I learned that at Chris's. I learned how to do that really
At
well
the
at
paper.
Chris's. Let's put it that way.
At Chris's.
At the paper, at the paper, I started doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I remember I used the analogy or the example of photographing a potter earlier. But I remember specifically this assignment where I got an assignment to photograph this woman that did pottery. And I remember taking all the lights and setting up. I shot at medium format, and I started shooting stuff large format at the newspaper. We had a 4x5 at the newspaper, at an old signer. That I would show up and I would build the picture, and I would say like, okay, here's where the shot is. Put the camera on the tripod, start lighting, start trying to figure it out. And so I had some of that stuff in my portfolio when I showed Heisler already.
Okay.
And that's why I said you should be a magazine photographer.
Sure.
So when I was at Chris's, what was available to me at Chris's was New York was available to me. And I have love, and have had a longstanding love relationship with, that genre, starting with Stieglitz, arguably, and kind of moving forward with Strand, Stieglitz, and then into sort of what we would consider like the modern stuff, which would be like Frank, and, then into, Frank kind of was a game changer, and, and then Winogrand and Eggleston and all those guys, right? So I really, really devoured that work. And, I owned, several books. I'm a huge book collector too. I have over 1,000 photo books.
Yeah.
And I really, really kind of have studied them extensively. And I think at that time, when I was in Munich, is kind of the street photography, for the same reason, kind of that idea of public photography started in Munich, because that's what I had. I had Munich, as my sort of tapestry, right? And when I was in New York, when I wasn't at work with Chris, what I had was New York. I didn't have friends, I didn't have assignments. I mean, I had some friends.
Mm-hmm.
Later in my tenure with Chris, I would say within the last few months of my employment there, I started bringing people in to his studio on the weekends and stuff, and doing like editorial type portraits where I would like set someone up and light them and shoot them. And, truthfully, I did work through all those kind of techniques that I did with Chris. I did the sort of like mixed lighting thing. I did this, I did that. I tried those things. I looked at them. I knew them really well because I was actually setting lights and testing before shoots anyway. Mm-hmm. So I was like, I knew how to do it all. But I knew that wasn't my work. I started to make pictures that felt like what my pictures felt like. Like I said, okay, that's where I'm at right now. Mm-hmm. And I use the term style, and I don't use it in a derogatory way necessarily, but I do use it in a way that perhaps it doesn't have as much meaning as using the term, and I've used this before, the term sensibility. Because I think if you have a sensibility about things, what it does is it allows you to look at something and kind of give your take on it. I feel like when I'm hired by a magazine to do a job, it's almost like, what's your take on this? Go. Mm-hmm. And you go do the job. And it's like, this is my version of what that is, because it could be, if you went, it would be different. If, someone else went, it would be different. So this is kind of my take on it. So I feel like if you can really be mindful of your sensibility and try to hone your sensibility, you can kind of be thrust into any circumstance and be able to interpret it. And I think that's where we talk about like the work being really broad, because I feel like I'm applying kind of my sensibility to the constraints of whatever that assignment is. So, mm-hmm. So I got to the end of my tenure with Chris's, and it was on December 14th or 15th. And of 88, and I remember that because I went home to California to my parents' house. And for a couple months prior to that, I'd been working on my portfolio, and I had a box made, which I still have, actually, the same box. It's trashed. It was like a clamshell box with cloth covering and my name embossed in it and stuff. And I had about 25 prints in it, black and white, all black and white prints. I went home to my parents, met with my instructor, John Gray from Moore Park College, who I'm still close friends with, who's an amazing individual, amazing educator. And I went back after Christmas. I went back to New York, and I took my portfolio out and I dropped it at Metropolis magazine, which you probably know Metropolis. At the time, Helene Silverman and Jeff Christensen they had a studio called Hello Studio, and they were designing Metropolis. They were a design studio. And I remember going there and then going to my Cuban restaurant that I loved, and then going back home. And when I got back home, I had a blinking light on my machine, and it was Metropolis or Jeff with 2 assignments. And I just thought, fuck, this is easy.
Well,
Right. Just go drop your book off and you get work, And of course, that's not the reality, but that was that reality that day. And I, and they were small. And it was really great. Like, I had a long relationship with Metropolis, and it was really wonderful because it was like, we have $400. We need a picture of this. And so I did everything alone. And this is in the 80s, right? And so I would say, okay, $400. Okay, I'm going to give this 3 rolls of film or 4 rolls of film. And obviously I process and print my own films or my own images, so there's no lab fee. So I kind of would figure out how much I needed to make or wanted to make on it, and then I would just kind of construct the project around that. And it was great, at the time. I remember it's like sometimes it would be like $250, and I'd say, okay, I'll shoot 2 rolls of film. And I would just limit myself. I mean, obviously, I probably would go over on film because film was super cheap. That was the old adage, right? Film's cheap. Digital's even cheaper now.
Yeah,
but
that's
right. I mean, the idea of shooting like 1,000 pictures on a job is totally like a product of digital for me anyway. I shoot so little. Typically I would shoot so little back in the day. So that was kind of the transition, and then I just started to do that exact same thing,
But what kind of work was it for Metropolis? I mean, do you remember kind of what you were shooting?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So in my portfolio, I had stuff from Grey Ghost, and I had portraits in there, and I had still lifes in there, and they all felt kind of the same. They're all black and white, and they all were approached the same way. They're all lit, and they all had a similar feeling. So I did everything for them. I did portraits. If they needed a portrait done, it's like, we need a portrait of this guy, this architect. We need you to do a piece on this building. We need you to do a piece on like the water supply or the aqueduct or I remember one was the Central Park Reservoir. I remember one was the big aqueduct by Yankee Stadium up in the Bronx. One was going to like the furniture show at Javits and shooting, which posed a whole different set of problems, but those were all flat rate jobs, which we've actually come back to flat rate jobs. I've noticed that's really common now.
Sure.
Is like, how much can you do this for? Or this is how much we have. And sometimes it's great, and sometimes it's like, I can't do it for that much. I just can't do it. That's not possible, Just if you think about travel and hotels, it almost eats up. It's like, I can't do that. Sorry, that's not realistic. But so that's the kind of stuff I was doing for Metropolis early on. And then I started getting some portrait work. I remember GQ was a big champion of mine early on. Karen Frank and Robert Priest, they were there, and they really, I remember I got my first raise from them. I shot like 3 jobs for them. And I remember Ruth, who was the wonderful receptionist that had the strongest New York accent of anyone ever. She was the receptionist. And I got to the point where I'd go up there. I'd always hand deliver my jobs. So I'd take the prints up and deliver them, because it was always a print delivery. And Ruth would be like, Dan, hi, what did you photograph for us this time? And it was really sweet. And then I remember going to lunch with Karen and Robert, and we were in the elevator going down. He said, how much do we pay you? And I said, $350 a day. And he said, we're gonna start paying you $650 a day. And that was just like,
Wow.
at the time, I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
I was like, are you kidding me? I felt like I'd arrived, but like this totally unsolicited raise.
So is
But
that
that-
like, is that the late 80s, early 90s that's happening with GQ? Late 80s.
Late 80s. Yeah, late 80s. So it'd been like 89, yeah. Because, see, I met Kath in 91, I guess I met her. So it probably would have been about 89, where I started. And then, I started shooting for Rolling Stone, started shooting for GQ, started shooting for Esquire, New York Times Magazine.
And you were still in New York during all of that?
All that, except for the New York Times Magazine job I got. I started working for Details a lot too. And I moved out to LA, and I met my wife on a Vanity Fair job. Started shooting for Vanity Fair early on too, for Vanity section in the front of the book, just simple portraits usually for Elizabeth Biondi. And then I moved to LA, or went to LA on a Vanity Fair job, met my wife. On that job, she was actually kind of my weekend contact for these two actors, because she was doing post-production supervision on a film, and they were doing ADR stuff, and she was kind of overseeing the ADR, and so it was like the weekend contact was like her. They gave me. So then I moved to LA, and I was nervous about that. That was kind of uprooting again. I'd uprooted at one point to go to New York, and I'd sort of wrestled with the city to the point where I started to love it. It was tough for me. I mean, think of my background was pretty like meager background.
Sure. Yeah.
And then moving to LA was like, okay, I'm back in LA kind of thing. But actually, I felt like LA was really good to me. I was a guy in LA that had a studio. And so you can get a lot of work in LA if you have your own studio, kind of thing, because even if you take the fees that you want, even if you charge for your studio, it's still cheaper than shooting at Smashbox for them or whatever, So I started shooting a lot in LA at my studio.
So during before you went back to LA and like you're doing some of the earlier work for GQ, Vanity Fair, Rolling Stone, is it starting to turn into are you shooting celebrities and well-known figures already, like before you even made the transition, or was it smaller jobs? And
yeah, it was smaller stuff. I think the first, and what it is it tends to be like, when I say celebrity, usually I think of actors for the most part. So I tended to start getting things like, I did a portrait of like Branford Marsalis, who's a brilliant jazz musician. Right?
I consider him a celebrity, but yeah, sure.
Total celebrity,
Yeah.
right? Total celebrity. At the time, not so much.
Yeah.
Right. And I shot that for GQ. I shot John Thompson, who was like the basketball coach at Georgetown, for GQ. So they're people of note, but I wouldn't say like they're like, household names, put it that way. Yeah. And I would agree with you on Branford is like total fucking major player, right? But like not a household name. If I told you always know if someone's famous if I call my mom and tell her,
Yeah, and she's like, "Oh my God." Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what about and I'm sure it's an evolution process, and once again, your body of work is vast as far as different, but you definitely came up with a portrait style that became very Dan Winters, so much so that there's YouTube videos on how to make Dan Winters, so where did that, did that start developing at all in New York, or was that something you came up with later as you went back to California?
Is there really a YouTube thing about how to make a?
Yes.
Maybe I should watch that.
Yeah.
Brush up. I can brush up a little bit on how to make my picture.
That's right.
So I think the first, the job I shot for Vanity Fair with Kath was Dylan McDermott and Tom Sizemore.
Okay.
Both were actors of great promise at that time. And Dylan certainly has had a pretty long career. Tom's has been a little more storied because of substance abuse and stuff like that. But so I would say the first picture that really so the first time I ever did a picture that it's kind of like race on Sunday, buy on Monday. It's like New York Times Magazine, Denzel Washington, like runs on Sunday, phone rings off the hook on Monday.
Right.
That was like, that was kind of maybe one of the only times actually that happened. But that was that set that I built. It was like a forced perspective set. I did that kind of on a whim. I built it by myself at the last minute, and the day before the shoot, and tried to light it the morning of, and it was burnt out by the time the shoot happened. But that was one of those ones where it was like, it seemed like a moment for me. And if I'm to think back at like moments, that was a moment that I felt like there was a little bit of a shift. I'd never photographed what I would call like a A-list celebrity before. Denzel was the first time I'd ever photographed one, and he had come into his own. He was in Glory, which he did an incredible job on, and then he'd just done the autobiography of Malcolm X, which I think he got an Oscar for.
Yeah,
so
pretty
that
sure.
would have been, that was that kind of that moment. So that was kind of a big moment. And I know that's what started my career with Details, was literally that Monday. Greg Pond was like, I saw that picture in the Times, I want you to work for me, kind of thing. So that was one of those moments. And then I think the rest of it just, I don't know, it's hard to say. A lot of times I'll look back at my work, and I feel like I missed stuff, like, man, I could have seen that better. I could have shot that better. I really didn't use that location properly, but I look at it all as like what informed, today. I don't know that there was kind of one that to me always seems like the kind of like the prominent moment, that Denzel picture.
Sure.
For me.
I'm not trying to pigeonhole you, because I think I learned that lesson of looking through your body of work, that's a really hard thing to do with you, because
Right.
But there had to have come a time where you got a call from an art director, and he said, "Hey man, we want that Dan Winters look," and you knew what that meant.
Yeah, I think more what they would typically probably say, because like you said, the work's really broad and very diverse. I think more they talked about, there was a photograph I did of Leo DiCaprio in 2003.
Yeah.
And I photographed him just recently again for Wired, but he the 2003 shoot was for the New York Times Magazine, and that's a photograph that started to get a lot of reference. It won a World Press Award, and it was very sort of, can you do a shot like the one of Leo?
Right.
I don't know that. I think I know what you mean. I'm trying to think if there's one like defined. Can you shoot it against green? I get that, because I have all these painted backgrounds.
Sure.
That I've painted over the years, and that one green one, I've shot a lot of people against that background. I like that one a lot. I like green for portraiture. It's very calming color in general. They paint, well, for years they painted the interior of like psychiatric hospitals and hospitals that color. Because it's very soothing. It's a very soothing color. It's an earth tone. It's tied to nature. Green and blue.
Right.
Or I would say, if you ask people what their favorite color is, unless you're asking like, a 9-year-old girl, who instantly would be purple or pink.
Sure.
For the most part. I think green and blue are very common favorite colors.
Yeah, it's definitely
people.
on the top of my list.
Yeah, and if they don't even know why, I think truly, I believe that because it's tied to like the sky or the water or the forest, or I think they're very like calming colors. So I tend to like green a lot. So the way I look at it with photography, we talked about it earlier, is we have like the materials we use, right? And we're totally materials dependent, right? We're dependent on manufacturers to create the stuff that we use to make more stuff, essentially, but to make photographs, right? So we have to take that and interpret it and apply it to the way we think in order to solve problems. And to a degree, the approach we take informs what the picture looks like. But then what the photographer brings to it is what the picture really is. So if we're going into a thing blindly, it's nice to have a fallback. It's nice to have something that we can rely on, that we know is going to work, that we know we can use. And is it like, I guess ultimately, I think Robert Adams, who I love, his photography so much, he said, I'll paraphrase it because I actually wrote it in Road to Scene, but I feel like I made it a little more succinct. But the idea of an artist starts to die when he lapses into formula. So, if you just start to like repeat yourself, there's a great line in Basquiat, in the film Basquiat, where Jean-Michel asks Vinny, his friend Vinny, Benicio del Toro, he says, hey, Vinny, how long does it take to get famous? And Vinny goes, 2 years, which I thought was brilliant right, in and of itself. But basically what he says is you have to make a bunch of paintings that people like, and once they like them, you have to keep making those paintings or they'll hate you. And I thought that was really telling, because it is a little bit true. It's like Pollock created that body of work and then kind of like went into obscurity because he became self-referential. Right. And then he obviously died in a traffic accident or by running a car off a road. But he did those, he was an accomplished painter prior to the splatter paintings, and then he started making those splatter paintings. And then he achieved huge success, right? Well, he didn't know what to do after that. So he started making splatter paintings again. And he was completely like criticized for it. But it's kind of like what people expect, you know what I mean? Like there's an expectation. So if I look at, for example, an artist, like if I look at Anselm Kiefer, for example, so he came into prominence in the 80s with those massive paintings that are tied to the earth, using straw and lead and dirt, and they were gigantic, beautiful paintings. And they had like, there was a photographic element in them and stuff, and those were unbelievable. But, he moved beyond that. He still like creates work that's similar, that feels like Anselm Kiefer, but it doesn't feel like Anselm Kiefer just decided to keep painting the same painting. And I think that's what we need to look for. We need to look for, there's a voice there. But we don't want it to be self-referential, consistently. Having said all of that, we have the artist's voice and the sensibility of the artist, which we hope comes through, right? Right. So the idea of like switching gears constantly maybe works for you. I don't know. I think it might confuse, there's also the whole idea of like commercial work, or I say work for hire work, where you're being hired to do work, and work that you're just creating on your own for yourself. Right. You can meander a lot more.
That is what I was hinting at, as far as like, there had to have come a time where you had clients being like, yeah, like the green backdrop and the kind of key lighting behind them, and that, has like, I mean, it had to have started happening where you're like, okay, I mean, that's bringing me success. Obviously I'm getting paid well to do that. But it sounds like you were self-aware enough to be like, I can't keep shooting that look, because plenty of people do. And like you said, and I'm not even saying it's a bad thing. You see it all the time. I mean, especially in the portraiture world, you see a lot of guys that, I mean, they shoot a look, that's the look you expect, like they're just, there's certain recipes that people have. And to see you, it seems like, to be so self-aware, to continue to change. I was just curious on kind of how that all came together, and I guess how you had the bravery to step outside of what was doing so well.
Yeah, I think that there are times when, especially now that we have websites, right? So back, in 2003, I didn't have a website. So it would be a conversation on the phone about, maybe someone would do some research, they'd pull some scrap, they'd have a memory in their mind of a picture and say like, oh, that one picture you did of blah, 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 whatever, Perry Farrell or, Denzel Washington, we'd really like to do something like that. Or, that Leo picture or whatever. And then now, usually what I'll do going into a job, we're talking about for commercial work, a lot of times I'll sit down with the creative director over the phone with my website in front of me, and we'll kind of go through the website, look at stuff. And, I really like this picture of Benedict Cumberbatch. I like that there's like a little bit of an environment in it. The palette's really beautiful. Can we do something like that? Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I love that picture. I know exactly what I did for that picture. I can make a version of that that's a different picture that still has that sort of feel. Not a problem at all, But, what I think someone that would be asking for like the picture of Leo or a picture like Leo, I think it's kind of the whole package that they're asking for. So it's like, I love that color, I love that lighting, I love the emotion or the expression. And for me, if it was just, I love the color and I love the lighting, I would have failed a little bit. If it's like, I love the tone of it overall, I like that expression, that's really cool. And then sometimes I just want to do kind of that picture because I love that picture. I love the way it looks, and I feel like kind of I'm a little bit of an author.
Yeah. When, cause you hinted at meeting your wife, Catherine. Did she then become your kind of photo rep and started working with you pretty directly? I mean, were you guys a team at that point, or?
Yeah, she was finishing, actually the film she was finishing, which was called Let Sleeping Dogs Lie. That's the film that Sizemore and Dylan were in, McDermott. When she finished that project, she started working for a brief period of time for Al Ruddy, who produced The Godfather, so Ruddy Morgan, and she worked for him for a brief period of time. But my finances and my billing and my organization was really a shambles. Mm-hmm. And so she started like on the weekend to try to help me out, like I wasn't a basket case that kind of showed up at the door and said, like, take me in. Although as time progressed, it became evident that I was kind of a basket case that showed up at the door to take me in. Uh-huh. And, like, my intentions initially weren't to try to find someone to help me, but it became apparent to me and to her that, I needed help. So what happened was she finished a project with Ruddy Morgan, and she stopped going to work for a little while and started helping me, and then just basically told Al, like, on incredible terms, by the way, too, mm-hmm. but I'm going to just not come back. And so she and I worked together ever since.
So how did the move then from LA to Austin kind of take place? Like, what drove that decision?
Well, I'd been coming down to Austin for a lot of years, shooting for Texas Monthly. Mm-hmm. And I really like Texas. So we decided to move to Austin when Dylan was in preschool. Mm-hmm. And kind of the standard story about it is that I was on the 101 taking him to school. He went to this school called Country School. And I called it Concrete School because it was the furthest thing from anything
the country
I could imagine.
Right,
yeah, the country school. So I totally called it Concrete School all the time. Anyway, and Kath and I talked about it, and I was like, we got to, I was on the freeway. I look in the rearview mirror, and he's sitting there in his little car seat, kind of looking out the window, and we're in like stop traffic on the 101. It was right by Lancashire, by Universal. And I was just like, I got home and I said, we have to think about like moving somewhere. And so we started talking about, well, where would we move? Austin came up early on because she and I had come down here for certain things. And so we just, she came down here with my friend Gary. He's a high school friend, still a good friend. And they came down here for like 3 days and found a house. He helped her. He's a carpenter. Mm-hmm. And she basically said, okay, I found a house. And I said, get it. I didn't even look at it. And so we moved, and we kept our place in LA. And so Dylan's had we built like this giant half pipe in the backyard. It's like 35 by 16 by 10. So it's full vert, and it was, it's right by a lake. So the kids just were always at the lake. Mm-hmm. He grew up like every summer just hanging out and jumping off the dock and stuff, and with his friends, and they'd come home and eat and go back outside and go in the water again. And like, I felt like we really gave him this amazing kind of childhood that he never would have had in LA. So what my life became me commuting to LA to work, which mm-hmm. I gladly did to afford him that. I mean, I think of my dad welding, he had to go all over Southern California for his job. He worked for the gas company. So wherever pipelines, he was a pipeline welder. So he gave up a lot to raise us on the Winters farm. So, it made sense to me. So, the flight's 2.5 hours one way, 240 on the way back, 250 on the way back. Mm-hmm. It's pretty low impact, so it was pretty easy. I went and shot that Leo job, and I flew there that morning, shot the job, and flew home the same day. So it was like I just did a shoot like as a local practice. So that just kind of became what our life is, and it is still. I still have to travel. Living in Austin makes me travel from work, which is why I was saying I like to do illustration stuff so much, because I can do it at home.
I was just about to ask if that led to more illustration work, and even kind of I don't even know what you call it, some of that kind of sculptural work that, it's illustration, but it's a photo. So I don't, whatever you call that.
Yeah. I call it illustration. It's kind of like I make the thing, and then the way the thing is delivered is the photo. Photographed.
Yeah, sure.
So the thing is really the illustration, but the photographic element the photographic process brings a lot to it, the how it's lit and stuff. So yeah, it's, I don't like the term photo illustration particularly, but yeah, those I call those constructions. But yeah, that stuff definitely I don't pursue that work at all, but I really enjoy it. And I've often thought, like, I've never even made an illustration portfolio and sent out an illustration portfolio. Maybe I should, but I don't know. I don't know. It's just, it's just the next thing that just comes my way. I kind of feel, I feel like that's how we're set up.
Sure.
We're not really proactive. We're a little bit reactive.
Well, and it seems like it came full circle in the sense that a lot of that illustration work involves you building these little sets. It just seems like such a full circle cycle of being like, oh, well, here we are again building, or I saw the photo booth that you built. And, it wasn't until I started digging into some of your past where I was like, how do you build a photo booth?
Yeah, that was a fun one. We went to this, there's this chain of ice cream places in Austin called Amy's Ice Cream. And Amy's husband, I guess his only job is that he makes sure that each Amy's ice cream location has a functioning photo booth. That's actually a photographic photo booth, not a digital photo booth. So my assistant and I went to an Amy's ice cream, and we both got ice creams. And I drew a sketch of the photo booth in like sort of like a 2/3 angle, and then I went with the tape measure and I just measured the real photo booth and just called all the measurements to my assistant, Yeah. and then we went back to the shop and made basically a photo booth from the dimensions of an actual photo booth. But yeah, I have a really big wood shop, and I can build anything in there. It's really big. It's like 40 by, like, it's huge. So we have a big layout table and table saw, chop saw, everything you need: bandsaw, drill press, air compressor, airbrush, paint guns. I can do everything there. So that's nice, having that fabrication facility, because I can, job comes in and illustration goes out, and we can handle the entire thing a lot of times without even ever going to source materials, because I have such a huge collection over the years. I've collected so many like artifacts and objects, and I have a lot of scientific glass and stuff like that. So I can kind of draw what I'll do is I'll draw a sketch and turn it in for approval. And then I basically build the sketch, and so I'll kind of look around and see what I have, and then incorporate stuff that I have into the sketch, and then augment it with whatever needs to happen. But yeah, I really enjoy doing that work.
That's awesome. Well, let's do this. I like to go through a few questions at the end of the show. And I mean, there's just no way. I mean, I knew going into this interview that, trying to get through your whole story would be a daunting task, because it seems like there's so many elements of it. But I think we got through some great aspects of it, and I think it wraps up pretty nicely into, where you, I know one more thing before I go into those questions. The only other thing I wanted to say kind of full circle was when you had the opportunity to go to Skywalker Ranch and shoot the Star Wars stuff. That seemed like a pretty cool, coming back to the story of, being on the movie sets.
Yeah, that was incredible, actually, going and seeing those Star Wars props. They've become such a part of our vocabulary in our culture, far exceeding, I think, what anyone who was involved with the initial production could have ever anticipated. Seeing those models was, it was like a return home almost, to a degree. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, we walked in and everything I had asked for was out on two big tables. So I walked into this, like my childhood, to a degree, and it was incredible. It was incredible to sit there and say, this is the laser cannon that I loved so much that I wanted to make a model of, like try to replicate it. Or this is a filming TIE fighter. This is we shot like a pyro X-wing, pyro Y-wings, the stuff that they'd blow them up, and so they're just like pieces, which is kind of amazing. And Vader's hero mask, and hero stormtrooper mask, and we shot everything. I mean, I had this incredible list, and they gave me everything I asked for, and it was totally incredible to be able to do that. So yeah, that was an amazing moment. I had a show in New York of that work at the Condé Nast has a gallery there. They have Condé Nast has a huge photo collection, and they show work there at One World Trade, and it was really neat to see that exhibition. It was part of a thing Sotheby's did with them, and it was neat to see like 40 by 60s of those models, up on the wall. And I don't know, that was a great moment for me, to walk in and see that stuff. Cause like, it's like when I work, I've done so much work with NASA, I did the shuttle stuff. It's one of those things where like never as a kid could I ever imagine, I could never have imagined that I would be there in that room, and let alone in like an official capacity.
Sure, I'm being a part of the last 3 launches, and
I'm setting cameras at the same pad that Apollo 11 launched from, that I like watched every minute of that mission when I was a kid. And I'm in the Lucas archive, surrounded by all these miniatures that I used to like absolutely like ogle over when I was a kid. And I'm there officially, and like the Lucas archive is actually facilitating me. And I had to stop. And, we did that when I photographed President Obama the last time. I photographed him in 2008, and then we just photographed him again here not too long ago for New York Magazine. Yeah. And when, and it was one of those moments where it was like, I literally like, I had 5 guys with me and 6 guys, and we stopped, and I said, I need everybody to come in. Like we kind of huddled, and I just said, I just want to just take a moment so that we can all acknowledge like where we are and what we're doing on this day in this point in history. I know we're frenzied because we're working frenzied pace. I mean, we had 4.5 hours for setup, so it wasn't like we didn't have time to do what we needed to do. But it was a frenzied, heightened kind of, pace. And I wanted to just bring everybody down. Like it was like 10 minutes before he came in, and I knew we had, a task at hand. It was a very ambitious shoot. We had a little time and a lot of stuff to shoot. And it was kind of nice just to acknowledge that. And I did the same thing when I was working on the shuttle stuff. I'd stop and, I had my son with me, helping me. And I'd say, I just want you to know that, this is the same pad that Apollo 11 launched from, and just to honor that, I guess, and to remember to honor what we do and how grateful we are that we get to do. I mean, dude, we get to go take pictures seriously for a living. That's amazing. That's how many people I know are just like, dude, I'm so jealous of your job. Right, I'm
sure. No, that's beautiful, man. I like that. That's really beautifully put. I mean, because you're right. I mean, when you're in the throes of the job, it gets a scramble sometimes, and it's hard you almost see it as an outsider sometimes because it's just go, go, go. And then in hindsight, you're like, holy shit, but I think that's beautiful that you took, you really try to take a moment to be like, I can't believe where I'm standing.
It takes 1 minute.
Yeah.
It's like 1 minute, it's nothing. It's nothing, but it makes all the difference in the world, because what it does for me is it brings me back to where I am, and it allows me to a degree to contemplate.
I like to ask this question all the time, although, it's different for you because once again, I feel like you have so many creative outlets, but one of the questions I always ask is, through all the years, do you have any kind of practices or anything that help you stay inspired and stay from getting burned out? I mean, once again, I feel like you have so much going on that it would be harder, I guess, for you to burn out, but it's something I always wonder about, especially more veteran shooters. Along the way, you have to kind of cross hurdles of still wondering what it is you're doing and maybe rethinking your process. And so how do you go about kind of staying creative and staying motivated to continue to do what you do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there are a couple elements that inform that. So one element, I think, is, your physical self, right? So, you get older, you get a little bit more sort of set in your ways. It becomes more difficult for you to travel. I remember like back in the day traveling, getting to the airport, running to the gate, back when you could actually like run to the gate, and well, you still can, but it's not advisable.
Yeah.
A lot of that stuff is like a lot more difficult to do now. So I would say like traveling is harder for me to do. It's harder for me to crawl around on the ground. I'm 54 now, so I wear knee pads. I wear knee pads when I shoot, and like I take care of what is required to make it happen. So I would think the creative part of it for me is never been difficult. I have so many things that I do that I think, I'm sitting at my model building desk, I told you right now, and I'm working on a couple things at one time. I was doing some airbrushing earlier, kind of thing. It's, all of those things I feel like inform the photography. So all of it does. So I read a lot. I look at a lot of books. I constantly try to kind of like fill myself outside of photography as well, ride bikes, exercise, spend time with my son, spend time with my wife. It's so simple. My son went shooting the other day, and he took one of his rifles, and then he said, oh, is the rifle cleaning stuff at home? And I said, no, it's at the studio. And I knew the next one was like, can you clean my rifle? And
Yeah.
so, and I was going to have resentment for that, because I was like, you should have brought home the rifle cleaning stuff. Why am I cleaning your rifle again, which I've done before? And then my wife said, well, you should be grateful that you have a son who wants you to clean his rifle. And that for me was like inspiration. It was like this beautiful moment of like, oh my God, it's the same thing that happened. I remember the same exact type thing happened when I used to drive him to school. And there were times when I really resented, like I'd be tired, I'd have to get up, and I resented driving him to school. And I feel like even if it was unspoken, like that energy would manifest, And so I was thinking about it, and I thought, my God, I could resent driving him to school right now, or I could embrace the fact that this is one less half hour or 20 minutes that I get to spend with my son. And when I framed it that way, it was life-changing, And the same is with work, It's like, oh shit, I don't feel like going to Paris, or wow, I get to go to Paris again, or New York again, or wherever, Wichita. Like, it doesn't matter. It's like every single time. So I think it's about how we frame things. And I think that's what keeps, I know veteran shooters. I've talked to guys that have been shooting as long as me, and they're just like, I fucking hate this. Like, they're just done. And I can't wait to go make my next picture, and I do feel though that that's a life practice, is to try to find the gratitude in everything you do, so that those things can still kind of be sacred,
I love it. Yeah. I'm a big believer in it. And I mean, it's something I tell people I work with all the time, just cause and it's not like, look, I fail miserably at it all the time, but I constantly remind myself of suffering or whatever. It always comes from the way we choose to react to the situation, and it sounds like you choose to see the positive aspects. And I really try my hardest to go about doing the same.
Yeah, I try to do that. Suffering is optional, my wife always says. But yeah, I think it's how we frame it. And I think it's life. It's how can we, my wife does these gratitude exercises sometimes where she'll write down 10 things she's grateful for. And I think if you're hired by someone to take a picture, when I lived in New York, I was shooting weddings for extra money on the weekends. I was charging $2,000, and I would shoot 20 rolls of Tri-X 35, and that was the agreement. The agreement was I was going to shoot it as though I were shooting a newspaper assignment, and that's what it looked like. And it was just like I would do for the newspapers, and I was getting work. The people that were hiring me, that's what their expectation was. They didn't want like a wedding kind of thing, but I actually I'd tell friends like, oh yeah, I'm doing a wedding, and they're just like, dude, are you serious? You're shooting a wedding?
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God, man, they're so much fun. Like, I totally loved it. It was like this social event that was huge in these people's lives. And they've entrusted me with this thing. And I got totally into it, man. I have all these photos, like Larry Fink's photos are basically like, cocktail party, wedding, you know what I mean? And they're amazing, right? There's no reason that a wedding photo can't be amazing. It's just the convention of the wedding genre sucks. And we know that. And so we apply that to like what a wedding has to be. There's a great photograph I saw of Ansel Adams. It was a poster. I think it might have been hanging up at Moore Park College. I think John might have had it. I'm pretty sure it was, but it was this picture of Ansel Adams, and there was a group of school kids and a schoolhouse behind him, and he was right in the front of the frame, and he was on a 4x5, but he was peeking back toward the camera from the dark cloth, so you could see the entire scene, and you could see him. And it said, the poster said, even Ansel Adams has to make a living. I totally loved. I would have loved if Ansel Adams shot my, like, 5th grade photo. Unfortunately, that's not the case. We got the conventional approach at my school.
Yeah, and I mean, I think sometimes just getting out of your own way, because it's easy especially as you start, kind of creating a path and getting paid and you build more of a career. It's easy to have an ego when you come into these situations and find yourself being like, man, this is bullshit. They should respect who I am. And then, you got to get out of that. You just got to not have that mindset and get out of your own way and just be like, I'm here to create, and that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, it's totally lame. That whole element of it, I don't even participate in.
Yeah.
I feel like, I just go do my job, and that's what I do. It's just what I'm a welder, but I have a camera kind of thing, All
right. Well, last question. I asked this to everybody as the last question. It's funny because throughout this interview, you've given some great advice along the way already. So my last question is always kind of advice you give to our younger listeners that are coming up. But, you take that wherever you want, just kind of parting words of wisdom, I guess, if you've got any.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the advice I would give to anybody that's following any pursuit would be, if you feel like you absolutely have to do it, then you're doing the right thing, kind of thing. And I would say, yeah, that's a piece of it. Like, if this is something that you're so passionate about that there's no another option, then you're on the right track. I don't think anyone should sort of seek out any pursuit that they don't have, I don't want to say noble, but like sort of reverence for. I think if you're going to pursue something and it's going to be your life's work, I think there's a real need to be reverent toward that and to try to understand it deeply, and not become a photographer because you think you'll be able to hang out with hot chicks, or you know what I mean?
Sure, yeah.
Which I've heard, it's like, I want to take pictures of movie stars or whatever, it's like, I don't know that that's enough, to sustain a life. But, and it's certainly, I don't think it's enough to say I want to make a bunch of money, because I don't really feel like we're certainly in a career now, or in a profession now, where the money is becoming more and more scarce, and I feel like our profession has become marginalized to a degree that it never has before. I think a lot of the apps that Instagram apps and Hipstamatic and stuff like that, where you have people take a picture and they'll apply some look to it and suddenly they're a photographer. I think that that's changed the way kind of people react to photography, and they marginalize it. I was a part of a mobile phone or mobile device exhibition in LA that Apple put on several years ago now, maybe 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some really talented, like, I was kind of humbled by some of the people that participated in it. And I had 2, 3, 4, I think I had 5 pictures in there, and they were small, like 6x6, 8x8 iPhone photos. And all the photos in the exhibition were for sale, and they were going to a certain charity. And like, hardly any of them sold. Like, hardly any. Like, I don't even think one of mine sold, and they were so cheap. They were like $150. And I'm convinced, I talked to the curator of the show, and he was like, no one's buying these pictures. And I said, people don't take them seriously. They're fucking phone pictures. The assumption is they can just go take that picture with their phone, when there are like really talented photographers using the phone as a camera, making beautiful photographs, absolutely beautiful photographs by any measure, regardless of the equipment. And I felt, and he agreed, like, yeah, they're marginalized because we're calling out the fact that they're being made on a phone.
Yeah, that they're made on a phone.
So, yeah, which is kind of a bummer. I mean, I like to say that I have a camera and there's a phone attached to it instead of a phone with a camera attached to it. But But yeah, I think, and the other thing too is like to just be really truthful with yourself. Am I working as hard as I possibly can? Did I do the best job I possibly could? Is this photograph the best it can be, or can I make improvements on it? But really ask yourself that critically, because if you're like lying to yourself about things, or not you, but if one is lying to themselves about the effort, the amount of effort they're putting into something. I mean, I see student portfolios and I'll see one that's like astronomically stellar, and I'll see a bunch of mediocre ones. And what I'll do in a critique, if I do a critique, is say, what could you have done differently? Could you have made this picture better, et cetera, to try to kind of almost teach that. Because I think work ethic, I was raised with an incredibly strong work ethic. And I think work ethic comes into everything. It's like, how much effort are you going to put into this thing? How serious are you about it? Is it important to you? Does it have value? What's the value you find in it? What do you find of value in this picture? Because someone else may not find any value in it. So what's the value you find? Because we have to identify our own value, our own worth in life, I think, too. So anyway, I hope that answers the question.
I think it's great. I think it's a great way to leave it. Dan, it's been a pleasure and an honor talking to you. And, thank you so much for kind of going above and beyond as far as giving me some extra time here. And, I think you got an amazing body of work that's inspiring for anybody that takes the time to really go through it. And you definitely, created some sort of a legacy there. So thanks for the inspiration and thanks for the conversation.
You bet, man. Thanks a million.
Revolution.